Okay, I can get this out of the way. All right. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks so much. I haven't read that.
You haven't read about it?
No.
You're badass.
That's funny. That's awesome. Thanks to Lisa, and thanks to her class. Earlier today, I got some really great questions about the book Public Figures, and so since we discussed it in that class, I thought I'd start by just reading a little bit from it with some background on how it began. So, a long time ago, I wrote a poem about the fallibility of memory. In that poem, I reference a moment when I realized that some memories that I thought were my own, from my own childhood, were actually images from the film Walkabout, which was directed by Nicholas Roeg. My father took me to see this film. It was about two children wandering alone through the Australian outback. But clearly he didn't realize that the film began with the image of a father lighting himself on fire in front of his children. I think he thought it was a children's movie. So my poem compared the shock of realizing that these images that I had were not from my own experience with the shock that the replicants have in the original Blade Runner movie when they realize that the childhood photos they treasure and all of the memories attached to them were in fact manufactured. They were given a set of memories on which to rely. It was all that held them together. Suddenly, those memories were no longer what made them human, but what made them monstrous. Has anyone seen Blade Runner here? How about the new Blade Runner? All right. Well, you all should go see that movie. It's really great. So at the end of the poem about the fallibility of memory, I wrote this idea. The photo is taken of the statue straight on, and then another photo is taken of where the gaze of the statue falls. This was an idea I'd been toying with since taking a walk one day in my neighborhood in Philadelphia and noticing that this particular Virgin Mary on Fifth Street was looking right through the cemetery gate at this. So having had this idea years ago about the points of view of statues and a shifting perspectival frame, I finally did some field work and I tried to turn that idea into a reality. I jerry-rigged a gaze-capturing apparatus that consisted of an extendable mop handle, a disposable digital camera with a timer, and some Velcro tape. And obviously, I've really dated myself because this was pre-selfie stick. There was no such thing as a selfie stick, so I had to make something up. And so with this contraption, I walked around Philadelphia, taking front views and then photos from the statue's points of view. This statue, erected in 1884 and located on the north side of City Hall, is of Major John Fulton Reynolds. It was the first equestrian statue as well as the first public monument to a Civil War soldier in Philadelphia. Reynolds was from Lancaster, killed at Gettysburg, and his nickname was Old Common Sense. And this is what he's looking at. Reynolds was very well respected, but his career had few successes. For instance, once after 2 long days of battle, he fell asleep under a tree and was taken prisoner for 6 weeks. I wonder, was that tree like this tree? Is Reynolds being forced to look at an emblem of what was perhaps his greatest embarrassment? Standing next to Reynolds is another Civil War soldier, General George McClellan. McClellan was considered a good organizer, but not a particularly good general. He had a variety of nicknames, such as the Young Napoleon, Mac the Unready, and the Little Corporal of Unsought Fields because of his reluctance to attack. And here's his point of view. So most figurative sculptures in Philadelphia are clustered along the river drive that is part of Frederick Law Olmsted's Fairmount Park. And they have lovely static views of the river and trees, while the rest of us are stuck down at traffic level with the cars and bikes and runners. When we were out there with the camera apparatus, it would take passersby a minute to figure out what we were doing. But when they did, the moment when they realized that these figures indeed have a gaze projected outward, they would kind of gasp and laugh. For the most part, the figurative sculptures around town seem to be looking at nothing. They have a gaze, but they don't have a need for it. So I'm not sure what to think of this point of view experiment, but maybe there's something I'm not seeing yet. While gaze catching, I become aware of the fact of our not noticing. We walk around these figures as if they were buildings or large pieces of furniture. We navigate the boundaries of these figures without a momentary meditation on who they are or why they're there. With that public invisibility in mind, I start to notice that a fair number of these statues populating my city are armed. There's a landscape we don't notice. Instructions come in a blue envelope, carefully sealed and stamped with the word government. Use a letter opener and slide it inside the fold, cutting cleanly across as you've been taught to do. Your gloves leave no prints. The mission is already dead in the water. If it hadn't been for a lucky break, which you failed to mention in your report, you might not be where you are today. The mission part is difficult. It requires a certain language, the language of dispersal and direction. It requires following orders without really understanding ultimate goals. It requires endurance and a cheery heart. What, in fact, was I looking for? I knew that part of my interest was in the landscape we don't notice. George Oppen's poem of Being Numerous begins, "There are things we live among, and to see them is to know ourselves." I set in motion some investigations. Ian Hamilton Finlay was a Scottish poet and sculptor. His greatest work is perhaps his garden named Little Sparta. This pastoral space is filled with words captioning walls, gates, trees, sundials, buildings, and bridges. Wave, I don't know if you can see it, but in that bridge, the word wave is engraved. Wave, little fields long, there is happiness, nuclear sail. In an essay on Little Sparta, Susan Stewart writes that in this garden, all space has been made semantic space. In contrast, if the city and its sculptures are a kind of garden, can it be called a war garden? It's a garden that has lost its semantic drive. These carefully designed emblems of wars past, symbols of values and virtues defended by spears and sabers, register only with the occasional tourist. What does it mean to look at these statues from a different angle? How does the noticing of this, our attention, our glance, connect to our noticing of this? How can a weapon and the body that carries it become so neutralized to the point where I no longer take it in? I've been thinking about how this might connect with what I feel when I read the newspaper. Is there a way to wake myself up, to deneutralize what I'm seeing? And I'll stop there with that project. And I just recently finished a manuscript that consists of 3 long poems, and we're going to read excerpts from each of them. And all of the poems take 19th century science as a starting point and kind of connect 19th century science with things that are happening now. So the first piece is called Motion Studies. And this project started by chance. I was in a library and I found a book with pictures that really interested me. It was called A Passion for the Trace, Etienne Jules Marais. I had no idea who Marais was, but as I think you might understand, when I saw these pictures, I thought this is really strange and amazing stuff. And so I decided to investigate further into who this guy was and what he did and what all these strange inventions were. So as with public figures, this poem is part essay and kind of part speculative fiction, and I'll read some of the first section and just keep this one image on the screen. The first section is called The Graphic Method. A small action sets off the ones to come. Someone finds a book in a library and is taken with the pictures. Taken with, as if an image can take hold of you and move you along. In the corner of each page, at the end of each paragraph, an image slightly different from the last. As the pages turn, stillness becomes animation. The 19th century physiologist, Etienne Jules Murray, saw the body as a machine, and he wanted to understand its mechanics. He created a number of ingenious instruments in order to understand the rules of motion. His first well-known device, invented in 1859, was a graphing tool called a sphygmograph, that's what's on the screen, which measured the rhythms of the blood as it moved through to the heart. He improved on prototypes recently constructed in Germany. Murray's version was lighter, portable, and most significantly, created a readable output. The analyst says, "Come in, sit down." The sphygmograph worked by pressing one part of a lever against the pulse in the wrist while the other part was connected to a stylus. The stylus traced the pressure of the blood in the artery onto a sheet of carbon. As the blood expanded the artery, the pen moved up. As the artery relaxed, the pen moved down. Reading the heart via the graphic method was a matter of translating a text of hills and valleys. "I'm kind of nervous when I take tests," says the bird. The analyst says, "Please don't move." The device received a prize from the Académie des Sciences, and Murray was invited to demonstrate its workings to Napoleon III. At the demonstration, all those present had the pattern of their blood drawn out by the device. An irregularity was detected in one of the participants, who then died a few days later. Murray's reputation was sealed. Reaction time is a factor in this, so please pay attention and answer as quickly as you can. Sure. They had struck gold. They had won the right to be forgotten. The ticket granted them that. All they had to do was sign on the dotted line and then disappear into the sunset, onto the horizon, around the corner, into the mist, over the rainbow, into complete silence. But for their breath, the noise of her pulse, of his, the hellish tattoo of the heart recorded in a line. They draw a breath and it's made visible. They have a thought and that's visible as well. Shallow breath and stealth, holding breath to ward off the tracker, to escape the censor, the reader. Murray knew that every function of the human body, no matter how hidden in the folds, creates movement. He simply needed to find a way to transfer those movements to paper, turn them into data to be analyzed. Prior to the sphygmograph, a doctor would listen to the heart with a stethoscope and then make determinations on what he perceived of the overheard pattern. The sphygmograph dispensed of that flawed human intermediary. As the blood moved from one chamber to another, it was the pulse itself that caused the graphing machine to create a visual record more reliable, more stable than words. "Is that part of the test?" asked the bird. Repetitive peaks, oscillating hills, steep slopes, climbing waves, hooked points, horizontal summits, descending plains, flat valleys, dripping stalactites. "No," says the analyst, "just warming you up, that's all." An eye blinking becomes a landscape. She sees him in his suit in the clinic, sleeping. The machine by the bed traces his breath and pulse. The charted lines become an ultrasound. The fetal shape becomes a shoulder of meat. The shoulder of meat becomes a foot. The foot becomes a heart. The heart becomes a skull. The skull becomes a face. The eyes and the face are in the rear view mirror. Rain hits the windshield. The windshield wipers wave back and forth, leave a trace of themselves from every position. Post-procedure, he's now a transparent man who lives more as a trace, a clue, data. She is the same, though opaque. They run. Tracker, reader, analyst, bird. Decades later, Murray's graph of blood was replaced with a graph of voltage and time. In the EKG's conventional form, 10 electrodes are placed on the arms, legs, and chest, and the heart's electricity is measured over a period of 10 seconds. Electrodes detect electrical changes as the heart muscles depolarize as they beat. The readout in a typical heart is an orderly pattern. EKGs are now available in a wearable biosensor form, tracking heart rate, stress levels, fatigue, and mood. An algorithm translates the data into tips for positive change on your handheld device. You're in a desert, walking along in the sand, when all of a sudden, "Is this the test now?" asked the bird. To disappear beyond the company horizon, she knows a guide who can get them there. There's a tense meeting in a coffee shop, pre-screened for infrared sensors. The guide shows up in a teal tracksuit, conspicuous, with too many devices clipped to the waist. As they listen to the plan, he can feel his heart start to race. She senses his flush, looks quickly to the guide to see if the flush is picked up, if transparency has been compromised. The guide, oblivious or faking oblivion, unfolds maps. Topographical lines in black, plum, and tangerine. This is the safest route in. This is the next best option. Special equipment might be needed. Though he has been practicing stimuli resistance, he feels his brain emit a strong electrical surge, his fever pitch. Is the map in fact a probe? Has their position been detected and registered? His paranoia is getting the better of him. The guide explains the topographical key. Black for flat valleys, plum for steep slopes, tangerine for peaks, not recommended for solo travel. Does she have a partner? The 19th century was crowded with graphing machines, of all of which provided a sense of life as a continuum rather than a set of freeze frames. Cardiographs drew the heart, thermographs drew heat, pneumographs drew the breath, myographs drew muscle movements, polygraphs drew it all together. What desert? Asked the bird. The polygraph as lie detector is a familiar crime story device. Picture the accused hooked up with wires to a machine, the stern voice of the interrogator, a needle drawing peaks and valleys, measuring veracity. The lie detector tracks the twitches and responses with a graph. It draws the body under stress. Its efficacy is dependent upon a belief that lying creates a predictable physiological response, distinct from when the body tells the truth. Doesn't make any difference what desert, it's completely hypothetical, says the analyst. The guide hands her a pair of glasses that provide a promotional hologram of what is on offer. As she takes it in, he keeps his eyes on the guide. Although translucent and unseen, he tries to relax his jaw, knowing that when the jaw isn't relaxed, what is produced is a visible tell. She sees hills in the background and crags laden with ripening grapes. She sees Poseidon motioning for her to come closer, then much closer, whispering in her ear about raw force and new energy and abundance. She sets the glasses down on the table and tries to relax her jaw. She keeps her eyes on the guide as the terms of the transaction are explained. Transport into safe, untraceable space beyond street view, new wilderness, on the condition that she wear a wristwatch device. His inner body screams at the contradiction. Disappearance, but only while uploading data. The hydraulics of his circulatory engine switch into overdrive. Vital force. The flush starts to spread like a poison, preparing to give him away, the folded corner of a page. He needs to slow his respiratory rate, thin the blood volume, slow the pulse, calm the skin to flat transparency. The connection between vital signs and the articulation of truths was eventually proved unreliable. For example, the 1998 Supreme Court case, United States versus Sheffer, determined that the polygraph yielded information no better than an opinion. However, the U.S. Department of Defense continued to believe in the link. As recently as 2008 in Afghanistan, it made use of the Preliminary Credibility Assessment Screening System, which consists of a computer connected by a USB cable to a black wrist cuff. Electrodes are attached to the fingertips with Velcro to measure sweat, and a wire measures the pulse. A series of questions are asked. Green indicates truth, red indicates deception, yellow indicates uncertainty. Do you make up these questions, asked the bird, or do they write them down for you? Are the lights on in this room? Are you now sitting down? Did you ever make a promise that you had no intention of keeping? Did you participate in placing that bomb near that road? Did you ever lie to take advantage of a friendship? Did you ever blame someone for something you did? Did you place that bomb near the road? Did you ever bring shame upon yourself or your family? The wristwatch device is actually an implant that has an exterior band made to look like a vintage timepiece, a dash of magazine fashion. The guide explains how it's programmed to transmit biosensory information like heart rate, medical needs, sleep patterns. It will be your guardian protector. It will bring good things to you. He had argued with her before the implant procedure. She saw him grab her wrist, but upon contact, the outlines of his hand melted away. She felt nothing. In an earlier moment in her life, she might have described him as a ghost, a spiritual manifestation of a past life, but she knows better now. Invisibility is a prison. Haunting is a quaint and faint manifestation of the tortured. He had ranted about privacy rights, as if they could exist anymore. The idea of them as quaint and old-fashioned as the fake watch face now sealed to her wrist. She knew there was just one way forward, and she understood the cost, the facts of her interior, available for use in a public data set as part of some kind of game. Besides, she hadn't made a fuss when he underwent his own erasure. Yes, I am a pawn. Can we please go now? Quantometric self-tracking, biometric collection, the uploading and gamification of a body. One could say that Murray's sphygmograph was the precursor to any number of self-monitoring devices that measure the body's interior state and turns the data into a graphic visualization. Skin temperature, galvanic skin response, steps taken, stairs climbed, distance traveled, calories burned, sleep quality, heart rate, steps taken, calories burned, eating habits, sleep quality, sleep cycle, water consumption, movement, steps taken, calories burned, steps you've walked, distance traveled, calories burned, motion, sleep tracking, body temperature, steps taken, heart rate, calorie consumption, number of hours of light and deep sleep, period and fertility tracking, steps taken, mood and energy, alcohol intake, work-life time tracking, blood pressure, body scale, body mass index, pulse. The analyst proposes the first question. The tortoise lays on its back, its belly baking in the sun. Loom, lark, sleepbot, wakemate, clue, glow, zeo, bedit, mood, nudge, cooey, wellbe, tick-track, go more, lifeband touch, pebble, heartmath, fitbit, flex, withing, simband, Apple Watch, jawbone, misfit, ultra thin, sleep is Android, my fitness pal, Kindara, cardiobase, I measure you, runtastic, Garmin Vivo Active, Zephyr bioharness. And I'm going to stop there with that one. Okay, so things go on with that narrative. This one is called Popular Science, and I'm just going to read a short excerpt. Let people get to where they need to go. All right, so in 1849, 6 years prior to the first edition of Leaves of Grass, Walt Whitman visited the phrenological cabinet of Fowler and Wells to get his head examined. This method of discerning one's character by mapping and measuring the topography of the skull first appeared in 1796 with the research of a German neuroanatomist named Franz Joseph Gall. According to Gall's system, each hill and groove on the surface of the skull represents the location of specific mental faculties beneath. A person could be known simply through intent observation and gentle prodding of the cranium. In 1832, Gall's collaborator, J.G. Spurzheim, introduced phrenology to the United States, where it was popularized by the brothers Lorenzo and Orson Fowler, who were later joined by an associate, Samuel Roberts Wells. With offices in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, and a publishing arm that produced books, pamphlets, self-help manuals, and journals, Fowler and Wells made phrenology a national sensation. In addition to Whitman, those who presented their skulls for analysis included Margaret Fuller, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Alan Pinkerton, Mark Twain, and Horace Mann. And this is the most popular version of Gall and Spurzheim's phrenological head. I think West Elm or Urban Outfitters made a porcelain replica of it, so you can buy one online. Now, in the 21st century, neuroimaging technologies seem to have brought back the desire to attach behaviors and mental processes to specific cortical locales. The allure of localization, of modular mental activity still holds sway. While passing time at an airport magazine kiosk, I noticed several magazines with cover stories on the brain. Time had a cartoonish image riffing on Spurzheim's diagram with a headline announcing, "The science of optimism. Hope isn't rational, so why are humans wired for it?" Scientific American Mind featured a story about the weird brains of creative people. Psychology Today's main story, Clues to Character, listed a set of stable traits that can help one predict behavior and suggest that knowing these traits could help one find a partner or evaluate a job candidate. The soft science of Whitman's day, with its desire to attach character traits to specific regions of the brain, is alive and well in the popular press. I don't know if you can see this, but this is Lorenzo Fowler's report on Walt Whitman, where he says the poet's leading traits of character appear to be friendship, sympathy, sublimity, and self-esteem, and markedly among his combinations, the dangerous faults of indolence, a tendency to the pleasures of voluptuousness and alimentiveness, and a certain reckless swing of animal will, too unmindful probably of the conviction of others. Whitman reprinted this phrenological summary 5 times, once in an anonymous review of his own work. The tenets of phrenology, at least in this particular paragraph, happily confirmed his self-concept. However, it's worth noting that Whitman never reprinted the concluding remarks of the report, which included the line, "By practice might make a good accountant." So for the rest of the piece, I used Whitman's phrenological traits as an organizing principle, and for each of his traits, I created a section that combined, like a collage, that combines language about those same traits taken from 19th century phrenology handbooks, and then with 21st century language about those same traits that were taken from neuroscience articles in popular science magazines, like the ones I found at the airport. And I'm just going to read one of these for sublimity. Situated on the side head directly above acquisitiveness and behind ideality, the donut-shaped machine swallows the nun. A high-tech attempt to read her mind as she communes with her deity, the vast, the grand, the majestic. Is there a God spot in the brain? Pin down what happens in the brain when people experience mystical awakenings. One with large sublimity would enjoy scenery similar to that represented in the cut. When the Buddhists lost their sense of existence as separate individuals, the researchers injected them with a radioactive isotope that is carried by the blood to active brain areas. It is designed to represent the waters rushing and tumbling over the rocks at the falls of Niagara, a large drop in activity in a portion of the parietal lobe, which encompasses the back of the brain, and an increase in activity in the right prefrontal cortex, which resides behind the forehead. They love the cragged precipice, the snow-capped mountain, the raging cataract, the burning volcano. Some would like to sail on the mighty ocean when the angry waves and billows rise around their tempest-tossed ship. fMRI scans of several hundred Buddhist brains from around the world. Sublimity enables us to appreciate mountain scenery, the vastness of the ocean, the grandeur of a thunderstorm, the roar of artillery, the clash of armies, etc. It is possible that some people's brains will simply resist succumbing to the divine. Nature, deficit, disorder. And then I'm just going to skip through these. So the last thing, okay, so this is the last thing that I'm going to read. It's called System of Display, and I'll just leave this image on the screen. There are general patterns in this intertidal life, kingdom and Amelia. Coral is animal, a colony of polyps dressed in algae. The algae give color, photosynthesizing the sun. Polyps have stingers, graspers, to draw the nutrients in. Then the coral exudes a skeleton, a shelter made from its own interior life. Cora is a dwelling place, life in the marine station, phylum Cnidaria, stinging cells. William Wagner was a cloth merchant's son, born in 1796 in Philadelphia. As a child walking along the Wissahickon Creek, he began to collect minerals. Collecting is the first step towards naming. The outermost layer of the earth curls over and lifts towards the water's surface. Look up through the water to the sky. Class Anthozoa, flower animals. I might want to make a form that mirrors the coral's reliance on its environment. The polyps are mouths that share their homes with the algae. In exchange, the algae produce food that the polyps eat. Except the polyps can't build a home to share without the food in the first place. sharing, simultaneous with just existing. Coral islands circle in the middle of the deep sea, craggy and jeweled before you. Order Sclerotinia, stony skeleton. Wagner wanted to be a scientist or a doctor, but his father had more lucrative plans for him. He was apprenticed to Stephen Girard, a merchant and banker and one of the wealthiest men in the entirety of United States history. At 21, Wagner was assigned the job of supercargo, supervising sales on and off Girard's ship, the Helvetius. His older brother Samuel was aboard the ship Rousseau. Up from the outermost layer, at particular sea level, you are just above and just below family Favidae or Muscidae, spheres with grooved surfaces. The polyps secrete limestone structures, corallum, that are as solid as walls, as intricate as cities. Reefs might seem an architecture built up from the sea floor, but their existence depends on the ceiling of the sea. We reach for the surface on the backs of our calcified dead. The 19th century geologist Charles Lyell wrote in a letter, "Coral islands are the last efforts of drowning continents to lift their heads above water." Seeming a piece of land, but in fact a team of organisms, read them as evidence, the tip of the iceberg, genus Diploria, once Madrepora, doubling back inlet folds. The ship Helvetius was named after the French philosopher Claude Ariane Helvetius. In his book De l'Esprit on Mind, he argued that all inequalities can be traced back to unequal educational opportunities. I am convinced that a good education would diffuse light, virtue, and consequently happiness in society, and that the opinion that genius and virtue are merely gifts of nature is a great obstacle to the making any farther progress in the science of education. In 1818, the same year Wagner sailed on the Helvetius, the first school district of Pennsylvania was established. Look for proof that something happened here. A gentleman naturalist keeps a weather journal, for instance. Species Cerebriformis, or brainstorm. Radiata and coral theory is breath from the surface. See the labor of the coral animals in a deep and unfathomable sea. Brain coral, Bahama Islands, E and H. After the War of 1812, American goods were cheap, and Girard's cargo was in demand. It was the era of good feelings. The coral was booming and blooming, threatening to block the routes. In the years 1817 and 1818, Wagner, aboard the ship Helvetius, stitched a long loop of trade, from Charleston to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to Mauritius, once Isle of France, Mauritius, once Isle of France, to Batavia, now Jakarta, Batavia, now Jakarta to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to Lisbon, Lisbon to Philadelphia, Philadelphia back to Charleston. Your rice will be up to Amsterdam tomorrow. The supplies of coffee in Holland will be curtailed. Sugar, the sugar is coming in daily. Rice, coffee, and sugar, unacknowledged metonyms for slave labor. The ship sailed from Charleston, a city with a majority slave population, to Amsterdam, the headquarters of the slaving Dutch West India Company, to the tropical slave plantations of British Mauritius, recently French Isle of France, and Dutch Batavia, now Jakarta. But the concerns of the supercargo were weather, permits, and profits, and for Wagner, the collection of specimens to build an impossibly neutral index of the world. Warming water causes coral to expel the algae it hosts, with that starvation and a loss of color. Low-flying planes above the great coral reef can spot the extended bleached bones in the water. I might want to make a form where a dead one comes alive. While 19th century lectures on ancient coral reefs are carefully preserved in Manila archival folders, 21st century data on climate change is scrubbed from public view. The brain coral has no brain, always united in a long wave series, a system of valleys with rows of mouths in several of the hot seas. At the opening ceremonies for the Wagner Free Institute of Science in 1855, and that's the Wagner Free Institute of Science, Philadelphia Mayor Robert T. Conrad compared the value of education to the value of the vivifying sun of this bright May morning. 12 lectures were given a week on geology, chemistry, anatomy. The permanent building was dedicated in 1865, less than a month after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. While the newspapers reported up to 600 students attending nightly in 1857, An 1869 entry in the Annals noted a medium audience, partially due to the demoralized state of society incident to the late rebellion. It is the only intersection between the Institute and the tumultuous events of the day that I can find. Professor Kirkpatrick lectured on civil engineering at 7, Dr. Child at 8 on the organs of sight. He gave a most interesting lecture illustrated by the recent eye of a bullock, also diagrams, weather bad, audience small. On the radio, in defense of a new sugary drinks tax that pays for pre-K school programs, Philadelphia's mayor says education is everything. 16th, nothing special. Dr. Child concluded his remarks on vision, etc. at 7, Professor Wagner at 8 on volcanoes, etc. A few weeks ago, a newspaper article reports that 2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef is dying or dead. Dr. Child lectured at 7 o'clock on the teeth, Professor Wagner at 8 on earthquakes, weather disagreeable, audience small. When I read the local newspaper online, an ad fills up my screen telling me to tell my legislators to axe the tax. Dr. Child lectured at 7 on the digestive organs, Professor Wagner at 8 concluded his remarks on earthquakes, etc. Audience good, but much disturbed by a noisy meeting of druids in the upper hall. Facts flex and change based on a determination of my likes and dislikes. Ice reflects the sun back into space. I might want to see the teeming archives of the organized world, single file in the valleys of convolutions. I might condemn empirical knowledge detached from culture. I might become a mineralized skeleton of the lily-shaped radiaria pouring its calcareous secretion on the parent mass. You might claim the current climate a form of denial. You might be a nervous system, inside hemispheres with valleys that extend the entire width of domed colonies. I might propose an expert separate from the world. I might inhabit an intramural furrow, a double valley character broader than the true valley. I might register a paradigm shift in modes of understanding. You might be a ribbon like Columella, feeding on small drifting animals. You might be the expert called into question. You might slip on the deep arm of the sea, an unexpected shelf trapped in a greenhouse gas mantle. I might opine that these days opinion determines fact. I might point to the problems in the celestial mountains, irreversible melting, flooding the ports. I might say scientific facts are symbiotic with human acts. You might reply, look up into a green sky of photosynthetic bacteria. You might argue that science is what determines culture. You might be devastated by the crown of thorns starfish and cyclone scouring, succumb to warmer waters and become a crumbling mound of calcium. I might want symbiotic bargains. I might shout that the earth can't buffer. I might dream of a broadcast spawner that anchors in the vast aquatic deserts of open sea. You might hallucinate the delicate arms of a basket star reaching out to predict the future. You might grasp and sting the brittle flower animals. You might want all of the surface area, all of the sun. Thanks so much.
So does anybody want to ask any questions? I think Jena would be happy to answer them. Okay. Yay, a question. Maybe Palmer will get us rolling with the question.
You never know. Thank you, Jena, for the reading. Can you talk a little bit about how you arrived at, and I don't know if you'd say that like between public figures and say this more recent work, if you're working in the same mode. I'd be curious to hear you talk about that, but like how you came to find sort of way into poetry that worked through this kind of research and so on, like when you were first starting to write poetry, did it work differently for you? What's the story of how you arrived at this kind of way of composition?
Okay. One of you guys asked in the class earlier asked the same question.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to remember how I answered it. And I'll try to be briefer here. I started out writing fairly conventional poems. Then I was introduced to kind of more experimental works that kind of made me really interested in language as a material. And then later I was introduced to a book called Testimony by Charles Reznikov, which kind of told the history of the United States, but through using found texts from court cases from the turn of the 20th century. And I suddenly realized that poems could make me rethink everything that I thought I knew. I thought I knew American history, and then I read that book and I realized I didn't know it at all, that somehow poems could help me understand history in a different way. And so I became very interested, particularly in the language. I'm really interested in 19th century language, just because the syntax and the rhetoric is so kind of, it's so much more elegant than what we have now, but also like way more elaborate. And also now the 19th century is super accessible thanks to Google Books and archive.org. Like all of the 19th century is available to us. We can find it and search through it and steal from it and use it, you know, to make things. So that kind of led me into a much more research-based aesthetic, I guess. Does that?
Sure.
That was
Yeah,
like very
it-
condensed.
it's-
That happened over decades.
That's an exciting answer.
Yeah.
Hey, the first one, I was interested in the Sublime one,
Uh-huh.
and the Walt Whitman, like,
The phrenology thing.
was that like a criticism to that, or was that like seeing the beauty in it, or can you explain it?
Well, I love those diagrams. I think
Yeah.
they're so weird, right? I mean, that's the other thing that I love about the 19th century is just all the engravings that you would find in the books are they're just so strange, or they seem so to me. And but yes, the piece it's a critique really of contemporary ideas about neuroscience. Because there's this idea that, you know, if we just put you through the MRI scanner, and if like that part of your brain like shows up red, that means you're a serial killer. Like it just doesn't work that way. You know, the brain is way more complicated than that. But pop science, it really likes the kind of, you know, what would you call that? Just like the easy answers to how the brain might work. Like, wouldn't that be nice if we could just put our brain through a scanner and like you could figure out all your problems? But it doesn't work that way. So I was trying to, by putting kind of pop neuroscience up against this kind of pop 19th century science, I was just trying to point to the flaws in that way of thinking, that like if you could just touch part of your head, you'll know like how sublime you know your life is, that kind of thing. So, yeah. So it's both. It's I really enjoy and appreciate the language and the images that are attached to both these sciences, but I think I also want people to think a little bit more about what they represent. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just, do you find yourself sort of like a collaborator with history and science? And I'm wondering how you pair some of these things. It's really fascinating.
Do I find myself a collaborator?
Collaborate with, you know, with the statues, with the phrenology.
Yeah.
I mean, I was trying to think, it's a little bit on the lines of Conrad's question, like what tradition you're kind of working, you know, creating, I guess, what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think of myself more as an observer than a collaborator, like just kind of being on the outside looking in at some of these materials and being really fascinated by them, but also wanting to query them, you know, and just
it's
like
like a conversation.
Yeah, exactly, and just to see where I could go. I mean, that phrenology piece, I was commissioned to write that from a magazine called Triple Canopy, and they were like, we want you to do something about neuroscience, because I guess they liked the kind of investigations that I did in my poetry, and I knew nothing about neuroscience. But I did know a little bit about phrenology from like another project that I had done, particularly this tidbit about Walt Whitman, which I just found so funny and weird. And I don't think I mentioned it in the piece, or maybe I did, but the second edition of Leaves of Grass was published by Fowler and Wells. Phrenologists published the second edition of Leaves of Grass, but I just, you know, can't quite wrap my brain around that. But so I just I just started looking and thinking and questioning and investigating and ended up with this weird thing.
What's going on with the Wagner Institute now?
It still exists. It
Do
still
they
gives
have, like,
free
11
science.
lectures a week?
No, but it does still give free science classes. If you go to the website, you can get the schedule, and they offer them at the Wagner in North Philadelphia. It's very close to Temple, but they also offer some in the city, and they have lectures, and it's a really beautiful place. If anybody is interested in this kind of old science, everything is perfectly preserved. Even the handwritten labels that he wrote, next to the specimens. So it's kind of an amazing place. Anything else? Thank you so much.
Thank you.